Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside one of the most trusted kitchens in American history. Warm, flour-dusted, and completely fictional. Not a real woman, not a real recipe developer, not even a real signature on the bottom of that letter. You wrote her in 1951 when you weren't sure how long to bake a pound cake, and also your marriage was struggling a little. No, a name chosen to sound friendly, a face built from other women's faces, and a voice that reached 7 million people a week, while the actual women behind it went entirely uncredited. If you're new here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of calm, faintly unsettling historical spiral. And a very warm thank you to one of you for suggesting this one. I hope you're comfortable, because we're about to spend a lot of time in a kitchen that technically never existed. Maybe make yourself a snack, something you assembled yourself, with your own hands, from scratch, or, just add an egg to something from a box. Betty would have wanted it that way. Dim the lights, pull the blanket up, maybe tuck in just a little tighter against the cold outside. The oven's on and it's always warm in here, even when it shouldn't be. Have you ever stopped to think what it takes for a flour company to convince an entire country to trust a woman who never drew a single breath? How one composite face, assembled in 1936 from anonymous employees who were never thanked, never named, never paid, became the most recognized home authority in the United States. Did it bother anyone that she finished second only to Eleanor Roosevelt in the polls, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a real person? What exactly were the home economists doing in those 30,000 square feet of test kitchens in Minnesota, cooking for you or cooking for the quarterly projections? The portrait updates, 7 of them, was that modernization or just maintenance of an illusion? The egg. Why the egg specifically? And what does it mean that she's still here? A friendly face smiling out from tens of millions of kitchens, structurally identical to what she was in 1921, and still nobody's home. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1950. The oven timer is ticking. The kitchen smells like caramelized sugar and gold medal flour, and the window is frosted over at the edges because it is 20 degrees below zero outside, and warm in here, and someone has laid out a very clean apron for you. The cookbook on the counter has a woman's face on the cover. You feel, somehow, that you know her. Good luck. You measure the flour before you're fully awake, because the recipe card propped against the canister tells you to, and the recipe card has never once been wrong. It is a gold medal morning, the same as yesterday, the same as the one before. You don't question the woman whose name is printed across the top of the card. You've never met her. You've written to her twice. Somewhere between the cupboard and the mixing bowl, she has become the most reliable voice in your house, and you have arranged the whole shape of your morning around her instructions. Her name is Betty Crocker. She doesn't exist. She was invented in 1921 by the Washburn-Crosby Company, a flour company out of Minneapolis, to sign replies to a puzzle contest printed on the back of a flour bag. Someone in marketing decided the replies should come from a woman, because a woman's signature felt warmer, more trustworthy, more like someone who might actually know what to do with your biscuits. Betty was chosen because it sounded friendly, approachable, the kind of name that would sit comfortably on a recipe card next to a cup of sifted gold medal flour. Crocker came from a company director named William Crocker, who had recently died, which meant he wasn't in a position to object. She was assembled from a dead man's last name and the vague social warmth of a first name nobody owned. She was born fully formed, in cursive, with opinions about pastry. The signature itself was a composite. Female employees submitted their own handwriting, a winner was selected, and from that point forward every letter that went out carried the same looping script. None of those women were named. The signature was a committee. The committee had a face by 1936, when artist Nasa McMine painted the first official portrait from a blended study of several anonymous General Mills employees, merging their features into one woman who looked capable, dignified, and faintly like everyone's mother. The employees posed. McMine painted. Nobody in the final image kept her own face. The portrait hung in kitchens across America like a patron saint of bundt cake, and the women it was built from went home and made dinner. Let's talk about what you actually know about her by 1945, standing at your counter with Crisco, chalky and waxy, being scooped by the cupful into a bowl of flour. You know her voice. You've heard it on the radio since the Cooking School of the Air launched in 1924. eventually reaching 7 million listeners a week. You know her face from the card. You know she has opinions about pie crust and strong feelings about the importance of the egg. Fortune magazine ranked her the second most recognized woman in America that year, right behind Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt had a body. Betty Crocker had a marketing department. The gap between them, in terms of influence over what you ate for breakfast, was narrower than it should have been. Meanwhile, a woman named Marjorie Child Husted was actually running the brand, managing the voice, shaping the recipes, building the radio program into something a third of American women arranged their mornings around. She earned roughly $20,000 a year in the 1940s, which made her one of the highest paid women in US business. Her name appeared on none of it. She wrote the warmth. Betty Crocker signed it. Marjorie Husted did this for 26 years. The oven is preheated now. The recipe card is still propped against the canister. Outside it's 20 below and the window above the sink is doing its best. The kitchen is the only warm room for what feels like a very long way, and the flour is gold medal, and the instructions are clear, and the woman who gave them to you has never existed for a single morning of her life. You turn the radio dial at the same hour every weekday, because at this hour she teaches. The program is called the Cooking School of the Air, and you are enrolled the way millions of other women are enrolled, which is to say you simply listen and do as you're told. A warm, even voice walks you through the day's lesson, a sponge cake, a way to stretch a roast, a trick for keeping biscuits from going flat. You keep a pencil by the set. You take notes, faithfully, on a class taught by a woman who does not exist, though no one has told you that, and no one intends to. The Cooking School of the Air begins in 1924, goes national by 1927, and at its peak reaches approximately 7 million listeners a week. 7 million. That is not a radio audience. That is a country inside a country, and it meets every weekday morning in kitchens that smell like coffee and cold window glass and whatever's been left on the stove too long. The voice you're hearing belongs to Adelaide Hawley Cumming. She holds the role from 1924 to 1959, 35 years of being a woman who isn't her, speaking recipes she didn't invent on behalf of a brand she doesn't own. She does it very well. Her voice has the texture of someone who genuinely wants your biscuits to rise, which, in fairness, she probably does. She is a real person doing a real job. The job is to not be herself. Let's talk about the letters. You write to her. Millions of women do. Not fan mail, actual letters, about marriages going sideways, about money that doesn't stretch, about a child who won't eat, a husband who drinks, a feeling you can't quite name. You write to Betty because Betty seems like she'd understand, and also because she's never once dismissed you, and also because her voice comes into your kitchen every morning and that counts for something, even if you can't say exactly what. A staff of home economists reads every one. They answer in her name, in her voice, in her handwriting, or a version of it, the same looping signature from 1921, the one a group of women invented in a contest because someone needed to sign something. The home economists are real, trained, underpaid, and anonymous. They are basically a customer service operation, except every reply was typed by a real woman pretending to be a woman who wasn't real, and the woman receiving it had no idea and found the letters genuinely helpful. The advice was good. The comfort was real. The source was a legal fiction with a pleasant voice and no body. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, you're following today's recipe. It calls for gold medal flour, which is a General Mills product, and Crisco, which is chalky and waxy at room temperature and scoops like cold butter that's given up on itself. The recipe is good. It works. You make a note in the margin of your notebook, next to 17 other notes from 17 other lessons. The notebook is almost full. You'll need another one soon. The recipes aren't designed to feed you as well as possible. They're designed backward from the product that needs moving. Gold medal flour is always in there. Some form of General Mills grain is always in there. The lesson is real. The curriculum has a sponsor, and the sponsor wrote the syllabus. It's a free class where the textbook is also the gift shop, and you keep going back because the teaching is genuinely good. Margarita, one of the show's home economists, adjusts her headset microphone before every broadcast, smooths the typed recipe sheet on the desk in front of her, and does not say her name. She has been doing this for 11 years. The desk has a small scratch in the upper right corner from the time she set a mixing bowl down too hard. She knows every scratch on that desk. The desk does not know her name either. You sit down at the kitchen table after the dishes are done and you write her a letter, not about recipes, about the thing you can't say to your mother or your husband. The money is short this month. The marriage is quieter than it used to be. You address it to Betty because Betty answers, and you've read the answers she sends other women in the back pages of the pamphlets. You seal the envelope. You believe completely that it will reach a real woman who will read your handwriting and understand exactly what you meant by the parts you didn't write down. The letter does arrive somewhere. A building in Minneapolis. A desk. A woman who is not Betty opens it, reads it, and picks up a pen. She has a job title, home economist, correspondent staff, and she has a signature she uses that isn't hers. She writes back in Betty's voice because that's what the job is. The reply is warm, specific enough to feel personal. It addresses the money question carefully and the marriage question gently and refers you, just briefly, to a General Mills recipe for something comforting and flour-based. She signs it in the familiar hand. The familiar hand belongs to no one. At peak, the correspondence department handled tens of thousands of letters a year. Women wrote about loneliness, about miscarriages, about husbands who'd come back from the war different and quieter and hard to reach across a dinner table. They wrote about daughters who wouldn't eat and mothers-in-law who wouldn't leave, and the particular exhaustion of pretending everything was fine while managing a household on a budget that kept not quite stretching. They wrote to Betty because Betty had been on the radio and sounded steady. They wrote to Betty because there wasn't anyone else. The staff answered every one. Each reply was basically a customer service chatbot, except every word was typed by a real woman pretending to be a woman who wasn't real, and the real woman doing the typing had a college degree she couldn't put on a nameplate. Let's talk about what you don't know when you seal that envelope. You don't know that Betty's handwriting, the looping, confident signature at the bottom of every reply, every pamphlet, every cookbook, he was designed by committee in 1921 and has been reproduced by printing press ever since. You don't know that the face you picture when you picture Betty was assembled in 1936 by an artist named Nisa McMain, who sat at an easel and merged the features of several real General Mills employees into one composite woman. Nisa McMain got credited for the painting. The employees whose faces went into it did not. They were the raw material. The painting was the product. A home economist named Florence, let's call her Florence, because the records don't name her, sits 2 desks down from the correspondence pile and tests a new cake recipe for the 3rd time this week. The recipe calls for gold medal flour. It always calls for gold medal flour. Florence adjusts the baking powder, notes the crumb texture, writes the result in a logbook that will eventually become a line in a cookbook credited to Betty Crocker. Florence's name will not appear in that cookbook. Florence's name will not appear anywhere. Florence goes home, passes the same billboard she passes every evening. Betty's composite face, warm, poised, and authoritative above a tagline about good cooking, and does not find this remarkable. It's just the job. The letters kept coming for decades. Through the Depression, through rationing, through the post-war years when the country was cheerfully insisting that everything was fine and the kitchen was where you proved it. Women wrote asking whether their soufflé failure meant something about their character. They wrote asking, sideways, whether it was normal to feel so tired all the time. Betty's staff answered carefully. The replies were kind. The replies also, almost always, included a recipe. The recipe almost always included flour. Nobody mentioned that part out loud. You don't write back after the first reply. You feel answered. You fold Betty's letter into the back of your recipe binder, between the angel food, cake instructions, and the clipping about Bisquick. You'll reread it on a bad day in February when the oven is the only warm thing in the house, and outside it's the kind of cold that makes Minneapolis feel like a personal grievance. The letter will still feel real. It was typed by a stranger on behalf of a fiction, and it will still feel like the most honest correspondence you've had all month. You are not Betty Crocker, but this morning, at a desk on an upper floor of General Mills, you are answering her mail. The stack in front of you is real handwriting from real women. A war widow in Ohio, a new bride in Texas, someone whose name you'll forget by lunch but whose worry you won't. Your job is to reply in Betty's voice, warm, certain, never hurried. You sign her name, not yours. You are one of several women being the same woman today, and you go about it carefully, the way you'd handle something that belongs to someone else. The letters ask things you weren't hired to answer. One woman wants to know if her cake sinking in the middle means she's doing something wrong as a person. Another writes that her husband won't eat what she makes and she's not sure if that's a cooking problem. You have a home economics degree. You have a measured opinion on leavening agents. You write back as Betty, warm and certain, because that is the job and you do it well, and your name goes in a filing cabinet. Let's talk about the volume. At peak, the Betty Crocker correspondence department handles tens of thousands of letters a year. Each one gets a real reply, typed on real stationery, signed in that same looping signature, the one chosen by vote in 1921 from among several women's handwriting samples. Your signature may or may not be the one on the stationery. It doesn't matter. Betty's handwriting is whoever's handwriting it happens to be today. A home economist named Gladys sits 2 desks over and reads each letter twice before she answers. She's been here 11 years. She knows the difference between a baking question and a loneliness question, and she's developed a gentle response style for the second kind that involves recommending a warm kitchen project. She slides you a letter without comment. You read it. It's the second kind. You reach for the Betty Crocker stationery. Gladys is already on her next one. The women who answer the letters are also the women who test the recipes, develop the products, and staff the 30,000 square foot Betty Crocker kitchens in Golden Valley. The kitchens run on their expertise. The expertise runs on their degrees and their palates and their judgment. None of that is on the label. The label says Betty Crocker, who has a warm smile and a composite face and a very clean apron and has never once burned anything. Of course someone has to burn things. That's the job. Bake the recipe, find where it fails, fix it, bake it again. You stand at a test kitchen station with a bowl of gold medal flour and a brick of Crisco that is, at room temperature, roughly the texture of cold ambition. You measure, you mix. The KitchenAid makes its heavy mechanical argument for several minutes. The oven door springs open with a creak it has had since 1952 and apparently intends to keep. You wait. The cake comes out. You write down what it did. The result of this, all of it, the letters, the testing, the careful editorial voice, will be published under a name that is not yours. The 1950 picture cookbook will sell over 1 million copies in its first year. The cover will show Betty's portrait, composed, certain, and impeccably postured. The recipes inside were developed here, in this kitchen, by women who are not depicted and not acknowledged, which is basically the from the desk of reply at the bottom of a CEO's email, except you wrote the whole thing, and the CEO doesn't exist. Marjorie Child Husted runs the brand, has run it since 1924. Her influence is real. Her name is not on the cookbook. It's not on the radio program. It's not anywhere a listener or a reader would find it. The brand she built has a face. The face isn't hers. The name underneath it isn't either. You finish the stack. You stack the replies. You move to the kitchen for the afternoon test. The oven is already at 350. The Crisco waits in its tin, patient and slightly judgmental. Somewhere in Ohio, a war widow will receive a letter from a woman who doesn't exist, written by a woman who won't be named, and she will feel for a moment that someone warm and certain heard her. She will. That part is real. You open the box of cake mix, and the instructions tell you to add 1 egg. Just 1. Everything else is already inside. The flour, the sugar, the leavening, measured and blended by someone who is not you. You crack the egg into the powder and stir, and a small, specific satisfaction arrives, the feeling that you have made something with your own hands. You don't know yet that the egg was put there on purpose, taken out of the formula and handed back to you, so that this exact feeling would arrive on schedule, every time, in every kitchen like yours. The original cake mixes, introduced in 1947, didn't need an egg at all. They were complete. Add water, stir, bake, efficient. Convenient. Women didn't buy them. The problem wasn't the taste. The problem was that handing a woman a box that needed only water and a pan made her feel, in the language of the era's consumer research, unnecessary. A psychologist named Ernest Dichter explained this to General Mills with the confidence of a man who had never personally wrestled a bundt pan. His recommendation was to remove the powdered egg from the formula and print "add 1 egg" on the box. Give her something to do. The guilt would resolve itself. He was right. The egg didn't change the cake meaningfully. It added moisture and richness, yes, but what the box really sold was the feeling of having helped. You cracked the egg. You stirred. You were satisfied. The box is still printed that way today, which makes the add an egg line one of the longest-running psychological interventions in American grocery history, and also the most politely condescending instruction ever printed on cardboard. It's basically the "some assembly required on flat-pack furniture," except the assembly was emotional and nobody mentions it on the packaging. The cake mixes were doing something specific during this period. Each box contained gold medal flour, and each box sold was flour that didn't need to be scooped out of a bag and measured by someone who might, in measuring it, decide she didn't need a box at all. The mixes launched just as post-war kitchens were filling up with women who'd spent several years doing factory work and were being redirected back to the home with considerable institutional enthusiasm. The timing was not accidental. Eleanor, a home economist in the test kitchens, is probably the one who perfected the ratio. Her name isn't on the box either. Sugar, meanwhile, was doing very well for itself. Average American sugar consumption sat at around 95 pounds per person per year in 1950. By 1970, it was creeping past 102. The cake mix helped. So did the frosting mix, introduced shortly after, which solved the problem of a cake that sat there looking unfinished and practically demanding you do something about it. The frosting came in its own little pouch. Add butter, stir, feel the satisfaction again. The satisfaction was renewable, reliable, and quietly engineered, which is a quality General Mills found quite useful. The cardiovascular science existed by then. It was accumulating quietly in journals while the Betty Crocker kitchens published cheerful photographs of sliced layer cake on white ceramic stands. No Betty Crocker cookbook has ever carried a nutritional advisory. No box has ever said, "This product exists because flour needed a delivery system." Betty Crocker couldn't say these things, not because anyone stopped her, but because she wasn't there to be stopped. She was a name on a box. The name just smiled from the portrait on the cover and suggested you frost the cake while it was still slightly warm, so the frosting would soften at the edges in that particular way. The portrait smiled. The cake cooled. You added the egg because the box told you to, and because something in you needed to have added it, and because whoever designed that instruction understood your kitchen better than you knew. You keep the red and white book within reach of the stove, and you consult it the way some households consult scripture. When you don't know how long to roast the chicken, the book knows. When the gravy breaks, the book has a paragraph for that. 1,000,000 other women bought the same book the same year, which means 1,000,000 kitchens are running on the same instructions tonight. You trust it without reservation. It does not occur to you to ask who decided what belonged inside it, or what they happened to be selling while they decided. The 1950 Betty Crocker Picture Cook book retailed for $2.95. That's roughly $37 today, which is a reasonable price for a book. Less reasonable when you consider the book was partly a catalogue. The recipes are good. They are also, with a frequency that stops being coincidental around page 40, built around gold medal flour, Bisquick, General Mills cereals, products with shelf space at your grocery store, products whose sales numbers are tracked quarterly in an office building you will never enter. The book doesn't mention this. The book has a cheerful red cover and a photograph of a bundt cake. Let's talk about who wrote it. Not Betty Crocker, who was unavailable, being fictional. The recipes came from the Betty Crocker kitchens in Golden Valley, Minnesota, staffed by trained home economists, trained women, professional women, educated, precise, and entirely unnamed women who understood the chemistry of a proper roux and could tell you within 4 minutes when a custard would break. Their names appear nowhere in the book. The cover says Betty Crocker. It has always said Betty Crocker. The home economists understood the arrangement. A recipe developed in a normal kitchen starts with a question, what would be good to eat? A recipe developed in the Betty Crocker kitchen started somewhere else entirely. It started with a product that needed moving. Dorothy Marsh, a senior home economist who spent decades in those rooms, once described the process with the careful neutrality of someone choosing words on purpose. You identified the product, then you found the dish. The dish was the vehicle, the product was the point. She said this matter-of-factly, the way you describe weather. Meanwhile, the book is sitting on your counter radiating trustworthiness. It has a full chapter on entertaining, it has a chapter on quantity cooking for groups, it has a chapter on the correct way to set a table which turns out to have opinions. The tuna noodle casserole on page 286 is assembled almost entirely from cans. There is not a fresh ingredient in it. This is not an accident. Shelf-stable products have longer margins and lower spoilage than fresh produce, which has a tendency to rot on its own schedule without consulting anyone's quarterly report. A home economist named Ruth Wakefield, not a Betty Crocker employee, a genuine independent, invented the chocolate chip cookie in 1938 by accident, sold the recipe to Nestlé for $1 and a lifetime supply of chocolate, and received credit under her own name. This is mentioned here because it happened so rarely it reads as remarkable. The women in the Golden Valley kitchens signed their work with someone else's name. The name did not belong to them. It did not belong to anyone alive. The book sold over 1 million copies in its first year. By the end of the century, the series had moved 65 million copies, which makes it one of the best-selling cookbook franchises in American history, a fact the cover does not share and Betty Crocker cannot confirm. Somewhere in Golden Valley, a home economist named Patricia adjusts a recipe card, crosses out 1/4 cup and writes 1/3, and goes home. The book goes on without her. It always has. You make biscuits now from a single box, and they come out fine, better than fine, reliable, the same height every Sunday. The box is called Bisquick, and it has quietly retired the flour and lard ritual your grandmother performed by feel. You add milk, you cut and bake. The whole thing takes about as long as setting the table. Somewhere a salesman is being congratulated for a train ride where he first watched a chef do this, but you don't know about the train, and you don't need to. You just know the biscuits work, and that the work is now mostly the boxes. The train story is real, or real enough. A General Mills salesman named Carl Smith rides a Southern Pacific dining car sometime around 1927 and notices the porter serving fresh biscuits at speed and asks how. The chef opens a tin he's mixed himself: flour, lard, baking powder, salt, pre-combined and waiting. Smith brings the concept back to General Mills. By 1931, the company has reverse-engineered the tin into a retail product, put it in a box, and handed it to Betty Crocker to introduce to America. The chef's name is not recorded anywhere. The salesman's name appears in company histories. The tin itself gets nothing. Let's talk about why 1931 specifically. The Depression is 2 years old. Flour sales are soft. Women are economizing, cutting corners, buying less. A pre-mixed product does not obviously solve the problem of having less money. A box of Bisquick in 1931 costs more per biscuit than making them from scratch. But the pitch isn't about cost. The pitch is about time, about ease, about the labour Betty Crocker has saved you. The convenience argument lands, even when the math doesn't. It's basically an early subscription box service, except instead of artisanal candles, you get the same lard you were already using, pre-measured by someone in Minnesota you've never met. A home economist named Hazel, hair pinned back so tightly it has opinions about the humidity, develops the Bisquick recipe in the Betty Crocker kitchens. She tests it 17 times. She adjusts the fat ratio. She notes that biscuits baked at altitude behave differently and writes a separate set of instructions for Colorado. Her name appears nowhere on the box. The box says Betty Crocker. The box has always said Betty Crocker. Hazel goes home on the streetcar, and her neighbour asks what she does for work, and she says she works in a test kitchen, and her neighbour says, "Oh, how fun. Bisquick isn't primarily a convenience product. It's a flour delivery vehicle." Every box sold moves a fixed quantity of gold medal flour out of the warehouse and into your kitchen, pre-measured, inescapable. You don't choose how much flour to use. The box already decided. The box has very strong feelings about how much flour your family needs this week, and those feelings align perfectly with General Mills' quarterly projections. By the mid-1930s, Bisquick advertisements run in women's magazines with the quiet confidence of something that knows it has already won. A woman in the ad stands in a kitchen that looks nothing like yours. Tile counters, matched appliances, exactly 2 children in the background performing contentment, and she is holding a biscuit aloft like it's a small trophy. The tagline varies. The posture doesn't. She has the look of someone who has just solved a problem she didn't have. You recognize the problem anyway. You have it every Sunday morning when your family is hungry and the lard is cold, and the flour has a film of something across the top of the canister. The Bisquick box expands over the following decades: waffles, pancakes, shortcake, dumplings. Each new recipe is also a new reason to buy another box before the last one is empty. The recipes are printed directly on the package, which means the package is also a cookbook, which means throwing away the box feels slightly irresponsible. The box has engineered your guilt about waste into a reason to keep it on the shelf. It just sits there on your counter, chalky, patient, and faintly proprietary, radiating usefulness. You build tonight's dinner out of cans, because the recipe card calls for cans, and the recipe card carries her name. Canned tuna, canned cream of mushroom soup, a bag of noodles that came from a box. You layer them in a dish, scatter something crunchy over the top, and slide it into the oven. Not one fresh thing has touched the meal, and this is handed to you not as a compromise but as progress. Modern cooking. The kind a forward-thinking woman serves her family. You set the timer. You have been given no reason to doubt a word of it. The tuna noodle casserole arrives in American kitchens in the 1950s, wearing the language of efficiency. No chopping, no prep time. The soup comes out of the can thick, pale, and already seasoned by a factory in New Jersey, and it coats the noodles like it was always meant to. The crunch on top is usually French fried onions, also from a can. The whole thing bakes in 40 minutes. Dinner is served. The kitchen smells like something warm and specific. Not quite meat, not quite cream, not quite anything you'd name on purpose, but familiar enough that your family eats it without asking questions. The Betty Crocker kitchens were doing something specific. The Golden Valley facility ran a staff of trained home economists, and they tested recipes constantly, not to find the best way to feed a family. To find new uses for gold medal flour, Campbell's soup, or whichever other product had a surplus and a sales problem, the casserole is built backward from the can. The recipe follows the inventory. It's a menu written by the warehouse, where the question was never what tastes good, but what needed to leave the shelf this quarter. A home economist named Harriet sets a timer on the third test batch of the afternoon, wiping her hands on an apron that has her initials embroidered at the corner in blue thread. Nobody embroidered anything on the recipe card. The card carries Betty's name. Harriet's initials stay where they are, on the apron, facing the oven, useful and anonymous. Now, this isn't unique to the casserole. The Picture Cook book, published in 1950, runs to nearly 500 pages, retails for $2.95, and within 12 months, over 1 million copies are in American kitchens. The recipes skew heavy on flour, canned goods, and branded shortcuts. There are sections on vegetables. They exist, but they arrive toward the back, politely, like guests who showed up after dinner was already over. The front of the book is flour, shortening, the chalky, waxy scoop of Crisco into a ceramic bowl, a cake that requires gold medal specifically, because gold medal is why the book exists. The cookbook isn't a service to you. Because Betty is a fiction, the recipe card in your hand doesn't have to say any of this. No disclosure printed under the ingredients, no nutritional advisory beside the can count. A living author has to stand behind a book. Betty doesn't stand behind anything. Betty doesn't stand. And the letters kept coming. Real women, in real kitchens, writing to ask whether they'd overbake the loaf, whether the gravy was supposed to look like that, whether this meal, this specific meal, meant they were doing well enough. A staff of home economists answered every one of them under the fictional name, which is basically a customer service chatbot, except every reply was typed by a real woman pretending to be a woman who wasn't real. The replies were warm, encouraging, often suggested a General Mills product. The casserole comes out of the oven. You set it on the counter. It smells like cream and salt in the inside of a can. Specific, dependable, aggressively there. Your family comes to the table. Nobody asks what's in it. That's the thing about a casserole. It's a covered dish. Whatever decisions were made before it reached the oven, you can't see them now. You are one of the women called in, one at a time, to sit for the painter. Her name is Nasa McMine, and she studies your face the way a tailor studies a shoulder, measuring, not admiring. She is building a single face out of several of you, your brow perhaps, and another typist's mouth, and the chin of a woman from accounting 2 floors down. The result will hang in millions of homes and answer to a name none of you own. You hold still. You sit for as long as she needs, and no one in the room writes down that the face was partly yours. The year is 1936. McMine is a successful commercial illustrator, the kind whose work ends up on magazine covers and then in the permanent collection of wherever magazine covers go to be admired. General Mills has hired her to solve a problem. Betty Crocker needs a face. Not a real face, obviously, because there is no real face. A composite face. The kind assembled from pieces the way you'd assemble a good soup, a little of this, a little of that. the end result bearing no particular resemblance to any one ingredient. McMine stands at her easel, studies her reference materials, and produces something smooth and pleasant and authoritative. A face that says, "I have never once burned a roast, and I know where you keep your fears about dinner parties." It is not a portrait of Betty Crocker. There is no Betty Crocker. It is a portrait of several women told to hold still. The portrait is unveiled. It is immediately hung, printed, and circulated. Women write in saying they feel like they know her. They do not know her. No one knows her. She is a woman assembled from the uncredited faces of several employees who return to their desks the following Monday and continue answering letters, testing casseroles, and receiving ordinary salaries. The portrait radiates warmth and competence from every box of gold medal flour in America. The women who built it remain entirely unlisted. It's basically a Wikipedia page where every source has been removed. The information is there, the people behind it are not. The portrait is updated in 1955, then 1965, then 1968, 1972, 1980, 1986, and finally 1996. Exactly 7 recognized revisions across 60 years, which is roughly what happens when a corporation realizes the face it invented has to keep aging in reverse while everyone around her gets older. Each update makes her look slightly more modern, slightly more authoritative, slightly more like the decade she's being sold into. The 1968 version has a haircut that means business. The 1986 version has a collar that says she has read at least one management book. She never frowns. She never ages in the direction that would require an explanation. Marjorie Husted sits a floor away from all of this and watches it happen. Husted has been managing the Betty Crocker brand since 1924. She writes the radio scripts, shapes the public voice, makes every major creative decision about who this woman is and what she says. She earns roughly $20,000 a year in the 1940s, which puts her among the highest paid women in American business. Her name appears on none of it. Not the radio program, not the cookbooks, not the portrait unveilings. She is, in the taxonomy of Betty Crocker, a ghost writing for a ghost. The 1996 update is the largest. A digital composite of 75 American women, the first portrait explicitly designed to suggest racial diversity, produced 75 years after the brand began. A graphic designer named Linda Bock oversees the project. Linda Bock applies the layers in software, adjusts the skin tone, calibrates the cheekbones until they belong to everyone and no one, and delivers a face that is pleasant, capable, and faintly impossible to place, ready to appear on millions of product boxes. Linda Bock is not Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker thanks her in no official capacity. You sit for McMine in 1936, and you go home, and someone at dinner asks what you did today. You did something that will outlast most things in the room. You contributed to a face that will be trusted by women you'll never meet, for decisions about meals in kitchens you'll never see. You say, "I sat for a portrait." For work. It's hard to explain. The painter was very precise about your brow. Every so often the order comes down that she needs updating, and you are in the room when it happens. Her hair is softened, the grey comes out. The set of her jaw is adjusted to look a little more certain, a little more like a woman who would know exactly what to do about your gravy. She is repainted on a schedule, the way a storefront gets a fresh coat of paint, and each new version is sent into the world as though she had simply aged with grace. You watch a woman who was never alive get younger, and then older, on a committee's quiet timetable. The revision schedule runs like this: 1955, 1965, 1968, 1972, 1980, 1986, 1996. 7 updates across 40 years. No announcement accompanies them. One quarter she looks one way, the next quarter she looks another. The transition is handled the way a mid-level manager handles a logo tweak, internally, efficiently, and without mentioning it to anyone who might have feelings about it. She is basically a brand refreshing its logo, except the logo has a face and people think it can cook. The 1996 version is a digital composite of 75 American women. 75. The company photographs real people, layers their features together, and produces one friendly face that suggests no one in particular and everyone at once. It is the first image in the brand's 75-year run meant to hint at racial diversity. The timing is not lost on anyone who counts. 75 years. 75 women. The numbers lined up so neatly that someone in the press office must have smiled. A graphic designer named Sandra Hurley runs the 1996 session with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this before, adjusting the composite's cheekbones on screen the way you'd adjust the brightness on a monitor. She doesn't frown. She doesn't comment. She has a deadline. The 75 women whose features are folded into the final image are credited in the press release, briefly, and then the press release is filed somewhere, and the face is deployed on roughly 900 products. The face is the product. It always has been. Of course, the updates track cultural anxiety more than they track anything else. The 1955 version is softer, domestic, a little more pearls and patience. The 1972 version has straighter hair and a collar that suggests she might have opinions. The 1980 version looks like she could run a meeting and still have dinner ready. Each revision is a quiet argument about what women are supposed to want to be, conducted entirely by a committee deciding what a fictional woman should look like. Nobody asks you. You're not on the committee. You're the one buying the cake mix. Meanwhile, the women who actually look like her originals, the real employees whose faces went into the 1936 McMain composite, have been dead for decades by the time the 1996 digital session happens. Their features have been circulating on roughly 900 products without their names attached for 60 years. The face travels from box to box, supermarket to supermarket, decade to decade, and accrues a trust that none of the women who built it ever collect. A real woman ages in one direction. Her face changes without a committee's input, without a target demographic in mind, without a press release. She goes grey when she goes grey. The update comes whether she wants it or not, and nobody repaints her to look more current for the fall season. Betty Crocker ages on a timetable approved by General Mills. The women she was made from did not get that arrangement. They got the original sitting, the uncredited feature set, and a commute home on the same bus they took every other day. The 1996 composite is the last major portrait. After that, the face more or less stabilizes, friendly, racially indeterminate, authoritative without being threatening. She looks like someone who would give good advice at a reasonable volume. She's been doing that since 1921, and she's never once had a bad day. You are 17 and you are sitting an exam in a gymnasium with thousands of other senior girls bent over the same booklet on the same morning across the country. The subject is homemaking. There are questions about stain removal and meal planning and how to manage a household budget you do not yet have. The prize is real money, real scholarship money, and your school entered you without first asking whether you wanted your future measured this particular way. You pick up your pencil. The clock starts. A company you've never visited is counting you, and you are one of millions it counts that year. The contest is called the Search for the All-American Homemaker of Tomorrow. It runs from 1954 to 1976. At its peak, more than 2.5 million senior girls compete annually. That is more students than take the SAT that year. Except, the only subject is how to run a house you don't yet own, for a family you haven't married into, in a kitchen that does not exist yet in any geography you can point to on a map. The scholarship prize at the national level is $10,000. That is real. The exam is real. The sponsoring woman is not. The questions themselves are ordinary. Stain removal comes up. Meal planning. Budgeting for a household of 4 on a single income that isn't specified and doesn't need to be, because the assumption is baked into the question like butter into a sheet cake. There are sections on hospitality, on entertaining, on making guests feel at ease in a home that reflects, warmly and without visible effort, your total competence as a woman. You answer the questions. Some of them you know because your mother taught you. Some of them you know because you have been practicing, quietly, since you were old enough to hold a dish towel. None of the questions ask what you want to do after graduation. Back in Golden Valley, Minnesota, in the Betty Crocker kitchens, someone is watching the numbers. 2.5 million girls is not a scholarship program. It's a database. Every girl who sits that exam is a future household. Every future household buys flour. The kitchens run on a staff of trained home economists, and the recipes they develop move backward, starting from a product that needs selling and arriving, eventually, at something a person might theoretically eat. The contest works the same way. It starts with a vision of domestic excellence and arrives, eventually, at a girl in a gymnasium who thinks she is competing for her future. A woman named Eleanor sits 3 rows ahead of you, chewing the end of her pencil. She's going to win the regional round. She knows, to the quarter teaspoon, how much baking soda goes into a standard batch of biscuits. She will receive a small trophy and a certificate with Betty Crocker's signature on it, and the signature will be in the same cursive that has appeared on everything since 1921, looping, confident, and entirely fabricated. And nobody in the room will know whose hand originally made it, or whether that hand ever touched a biscuit in its life. The contest ends in 1976. No announcement, no ceremony for its passing. It runs for 22 years, tests somewhere between 30 and 50 million girls in total, depending on how you count the regional rounds, distributes scholarship money that is real and finite and considerably less than the value of what it measured, and then it stops. The gymnasium empties out. The booklets go into a box. The clock, which has very clear opinions about time, even when you don't, moves on without comment. You work in the kitchens, the real ones, 30,000 square feet of them, where the recipes that carry her name are actually made. This morning you are not asked what would feed a family well. You are asked to find 3 new things to do with a flour the company needs to move more of, and to find them by Friday. You start from the product and work backward toward a recipe, which is the opposite of how your mother cooked. You are very good at this. Your degree is in nutrition, and you notice that no one in this building has asked you about nutrition in some time. The kitchens are immaculate, gleaming, and faintly chalky with flour. White tile, white appliances, the faint chalk smell of flour that has settled into every surface so thoroughly the building itself seems to exhale it. At peak, there are about 50 home economists working here, women with real credentials, real degrees, real opinions, and their job, stated plainly, is to find a reason for you to open a box. The KitchenAid mixer runs. The oven springs open. Someone is making the same pound cake for the 4th time this week, adjusting the ratio of gold medal flour by 2 tablespoons, writing the result on a clipboard, starting again. The clipboard has never once asked whether anyone needed pound cake. The process runs in one direction only. A product team upstairs has a problem, say, a new variety of Bisquick isn't moving the way they'd hoped. The brief comes down, you develop 12 recipes using it, you test them, you narrow to 3. The 3 get photographed, written up and sent out under her name. Nobody upstairs asks you if Bisquick is something families need. The question isn't nutrition. The question is throughput. It's basically Spotify's recommendation algorithm, except every song is secretly an ad for flour and you wrote all the songs. Sometimes a product is already failing before it reaches you. The tuna noodle casserole is a good example. Cans, a box, a sleeve of crushed crackers on top for what the recipe calls texture. It photographs beautifully under the kitchen lights. A home economist named Patricia squares up the serving dish, adjusts the cracker crust with a butter knife until it looks artless, and steps back. The camera fires. Patricia has made this casserole 11 times. She doesn't eat it anymore. Your degree sits behind all of this, quietly useless. You know what sugar does, roughly. You know what happens when refined carbohydrates displace other things on a plate, year after year, at scale. The picture cook book from 1950, the one sitting in a million kitchens right now, is built almost entirely on flour and shortening, with Crisco scooped in by the cupful, chalky and waxy, the way you'd add gravel if gravel were a recipe. You didn't write that book, but you work in the building where books like it are made. Start with what needs selling, build backward, make it delicious. The nutritional advisory is someone else's problem, and by structural coincidence, that someone else doesn't exist. Of course the recipes are good. That's not in question. The women in these kitchens are genuinely skilled. They test obsessively, they calibrate, they care, and the food that comes out of here works. The pound cake rises, the casserole browns evenly. The instructions are clear because these women made them clear, running the same test until it was impossible to fail. What the recipes are optimized for, though, is not nourishment, it's repeatability. The recipe must work for a woman with a gas range and a nervous Tuesday afternoon and a family that will not be impressed by effort. The recipe must work, and it must require gold medal flour, and it must photograph well, and the rest is your business, and nobody's asking. You take the clipboard, you write down the flour ratio, you note that it worked. You wrote the recipe, you tested it, 11 times, adjusted the salt, timed the bake, typed the card clean. When it goes out to 1 million kitchens, it carries her name and not yours. And this is not an oversight. It is the arrangement, the one you agreed to without quite remembering agreeing to it. You are a college-educated woman doing skilled work for a wage smaller than the men down the hall earn for theirs. You watch your own sentences leave the building under a signature that belongs to no one at all, and then you go back to your desk and start the next card. Marjorie Child Husted ran the brand from 1924 to 1950, 26 years. She built the radio program, shaped the voice, managed the correspondence operation, and wrote the philosophy of what Betty Crocker was supposed to be. At her peak, she earned around $20,000 a year, which in today's money sits somewhere near $250,000. That made her one of the highest paid women in American business. Her name appeared on none of it. Not the cookbooks, not the radio credits, not the correspondence that went to 7 million listeners a week. She handed the brand to General Mills fully formed and walked out the door, and if you look at the spine of a 1950 picture cookbook, you will not find her there. Then there were the letters. Women wrote to Betty Crocker, the way you write to someone you trust, about a husband who doesn't eat what she makes, about a budget that doesn't cover the week, about a mother-in-law with opinions about pie crust. Sincere, specific, private letters, the kind you seal carefully. A staff of home economists opened them, read them, and wrote back, as her, which is basically a customer service operation, except every reply was typed by a real woman pretending to be a woman who wasn't real, and the person reading it thought she'd made a friend. The signatures were practiced. The warmth was consistent. The stationery had her name across the top in that familiar rounded hand, the one a contest entrant had submitted back in 1921, and nobody had ever changed. You sit at your desk and you write, in Betty's voice, to a woman in Ohio who is having a hard winter. You tell her the pot roast will come out fine. You sign the name. You go home. You come back tomorrow and do it again. Now consider what that costs over years. Not the labour, the other thing, the specific texture of writing warmth you don't get to own. A home economist named Edith Hickson adjusts her posture, pulls the next envelope from the stack, reads it carefully, and sets it in the reply pile with the small, neutral, faintly practiced expression of someone who has long since stopped counting. The pile does not get smaller, it gets redistributed. The uncredited portrait worked the same way. Nasa McMain stood at her easel in 1936 with photographs of several General Mills employees arranged around the canvas and painted one face from all of them. None of the women whose features she borrowed were named in the result. The painting went to print, went to radio stations, went to the front of the cookbook, a composite of real people, presented as one fictional one, trusted by millions as though she had a history and a kitchen, and opinions formed by actual experience. She had the face of women who did, that's different, and the portrait kept getting updated. 1955, 1965, 1968, 1972. Each time someone at General Mills decided she looked slightly wrong for the decade and hired someone to fix her, the cheekbones shifted, the hairstyle adjusted, the expression moved from warm and deferential toward warm and capable. It's basically a logo refresh, except the logo had a face, and the people buying the cookbook thought she could cook. The real women whose work filled those pages got no such update. Their names stayed off the cover, evergreen, in their way. You report, in practice, to a woman named Marjorie, and Marjorie runs the whole thing, the radio, the letters, the books, the voice. She is among the highest paid women in the country, which you would never guess from how rarely her name appears anywhere at all. She built the trustworthy friend that millions of households lean on, and she built it from an office, on a salary, maintaining a fiction on purpose because the fiction was the job. You bring her a draft. She reads it, marks it in pencil, hands it back. The woman everyone trusts has a manager, and the manager has a desk and a deadline. Marjorie Child Husted took over the brand in 1924 and ran it for 26 years. She's earning around $20,000 a year at peak, roughly $250,000 in today's terms, which made her one of the highest compensated women in American business. She manages the radio program, the correspondence operation, the test kitchen staff, the tone of every recipe card, and every broadcast. She decides what Betty Crocker sounds like, what she cares about, what she worries over. Not once does her name appear on the label. What Marjorie actually built was not a product. It was a relationship. She understood, very early, that a woman buying flour wasn't buying flour. She was looking for someone who knew what she was dealing with. A voice that understood the particular exhaustion of 4 p.m. on a Tuesday with 4 people expecting dinner and a kitchen that doesn't cooperate. Marjorie wrote toward that feeling with precision, for decades, under someone else's name. The desk lamp in her office stays on late, the name on the cookbook doesn't. She retires in 1950, the same year the picture cookbook ships its first 1,000,000 copies. The timing is almost funny. The book that would define Betty Crocker for a generation arrives just as the woman who defined Betty Crocker quietly leaves the building. The cookbook sells for $2.95. Marjorie's contribution to it is listed nowhere inside. A real person can ask for credit. A real person can give interviews, write a memoir, correct the record. Marjorie is a real person. Betty Crocker is not, which means Betty Crocker can't be pressured, contradicted, or retired without a corporate decision. The fiction simply continues, freshly painted every decade, while the people who operate her move on without ceremony. Dorothy Foster, one of Marjorie's staff home economists, keeps a folder of handwritten letters from listeners, real letters. A woman in Ohio writes about her husband's appetite and her failing confidence. A girl in Georgia writes asking what to do when the cake falls. Dorothy reads each one at her desk, selects a recipe, composes a reply, and signs it in a hand that is familiar, looping, and entirely borrowed. The woman in Ohio writes back to say thank you, that it helped, that she feels less alone. She addresses the reply to Betty. Dorothy files it without comment. By the time Marjorie leaves, the operation has a kind of institutional weight to it. 30 years of answered letters, 7 million radio listeners a week, a cookbook moving through households like a well-behaved rumour. She built all of it. The brand absorbed it completely, the way a very large, friendly organisation absorbs things, warmly, thoroughly, and without a receipt. The pencil marks on your draft are still there when you retype it. Nobody asks where they came from. You cook around the rationing now, and she helps you do it. Sugar is short, butter is short, meat is a weekly negotiation. But the lessons on the radio keep finding ways through. Substitute this, stretch that, make do, and smile about it. You notice, if you stop long enough to notice, that one ingredient never gets rationed out of the lesson. The flour stays. The flour is always central, always plentiful, always hers. You are being kept fed and patriotic and, without ever being told so directly, kept buying the one thing the company most needs you to keep buying. The war effort rationing books are real, the shortages are real. The woman guiding you through them is not. But her voice is warm and her suggestions are practical, and when she tells you to stretch a pound of ground beef with gold medal breadcrumbs, you do it, because what else are you going to do? The breadcrumbs are gold medal. The flour for the biscuits that soak up the gravy is gold medal. The thickener in the creamed anything is gold medal. The flour never went to war. The rationing recipes themselves are revealing. A typical wartime Betty Crocker suggestion is a hot dish, a casserole, technically, though nobody calls it that yet, built from canned goods, dried starch, and whatever proteins the ration book allows this week. The usual cans, a box of noodles, crackers crushed on top. You assemble it in a 9 by 13 glass dish and call it dinner. The crackers on top are also a flour product. The crackers have not noticed this conflict of interest. A home economist named Vivian Pelham reads through a stack of listener letters before the broadcast on a Tuesday in March 1943. One woman writes that she cried making a birthday cake because she couldn't get enough sugar. Vivian writes back as Betty, neat, warm, and faintly maternal, and suggests a honey-sweetened applesauce loaf that doesn't need the full ration. She means it kindly. She's typed 100 of these. The loaf recipe calls for 2 cups of flour. Vivian doesn't decide that. The recipe developers decide that. The recipe developers work backward from what needs selling. Of course, the wartime guidance wasn't purely cynical. The home economists were real professionals, and some of the substitutions were genuinely useful. Dried milk powder stretched further than fresh. Oat extended meatloaf was better than no meatloaf. And vitamins added flour was a legitimate public health contribution. You do eat better on some nights because of what came through the radio. This is the part that makes it complicated. The needle is threaded. The service is real. The commercial architecture underneath it is also real. What you don't hear on the radio, ever, is anything about the wheat industry's wartime contract arrangements, or the fact that flour was specifically and deliberately kept off the primary rationing list, or that this was not an accident. The flour ration is conspicuous in its absence. The way a guest who didn't get drafted is conspicuous at a table of men who did. You notice, or you don't. Most people don't, because why would you when the voice on the radio is helping you feed your family and she sounds like someone who genuinely cares? She does care. The caring is built in, tested, refined, broadcast to 7 million people a week. The caring is the product, the flour is what the product is made of, and the woman doing the caring has a name that isn't hers and a face that belongs to several people at once. Somewhere in Golden Valley, Minnesota, it's -20 and the test kitchen ovens are running, and the flour is warm, and everything smells like something you want to go home to. You spent the war on a factory floor, riveting, earning, clocking in and out with a number that was yours. Now the war is over and you are being escorted, gently and from every direction at once, back to the kitchen. The magazines, the radio, the recipe cards all agree on where you belong now, and they agree warmly, without once raising their voices. She is part of the agreeing. Her lessons resume as though the factory years were a brief, slightly embarrassing detour. You hang up the coveralls. You pick the apron back up. Nobody calls it anything but progress. The tone is important. Nobody yells. Nobody threatens. The redirection arrives in the register of encouragement. Warm, competent, just slightly breathless with possibility. There are casseroles to learn. There are proper crusts to master. A woman on the radio explains that this is your real work, your best work, the kind that lasts. She sounds like she means it. She does mean it, in the sense that the voice actor playing her means it, and in the sense that the home economists writing the script mean it, and in the sense that General Mills very much means it. The sincerity is distributed across several actual women and one woman who never existed, and from the outside it is impossible to tell the difference. What's waiting for you in the kitchen isn't the kitchen you left. The post-war kitchen has been upgraded. There's a new refrigerator, white, boxy, humming with institutional confidence. There's a stand mixer, heavy as a small engine block, bolted to the counter by gravity alone. The oven door springs open with a metallic creak it will make for the next 30 years. Everything is clean and correct and slightly aspirational, the way a hotel room is slightly aspirational. You stand in the middle of it and feel you should be doing something. She has suggestions. She always has suggestions. The Betty Crocker radio program has resumed with fresh recipes, new tips, and a tone adjusted precisely 2 degrees toward domesticity and away from wartime emergency. The substitution lessons are over. The abundance lessons have begun. Gold medal flour, Crisco shortening by the cupful, a full cup of sugar. The recipes move fast now. There are more of them. A home economist named Lorraine Folger types them in the Golden Valley test kitchen, signs them with someone else's name, and goes home. The letters still arrive. This is the part worth sitting with. You spent 4 years running lathes and reading classified torque specifications, and now you write to ask whether the kitchen you've returned to is one you actually want. You don't quite put it that way. You ask about pot roast timing and whether baking powder goes stale, but underneath those questions is another question, and it is not about pot roast. A home economist reads the letter. She writes back in a warm, direct hand. The reply is honest about the baking powder. It says nothing about the other thing. Betty Crocker has never been able to answer the other thing. She is structurally not equipped for it. She was designed for flour. The 1950 picture cookbook lands in stores at $2.95, roughly $37 today, and sells over 1 million copies in its first year. It is organized, cheerful, and relentlessly thorough, with photographs of gleaming dishes on gleaming surfaces, all of them flour forward, most of them featuring a gold medal product in the first 3 lines. The book doesn't say it's an advertisement. It isn't, exactly. It's also not an advertisement. A recipe for lemon bars does not pause to mention which company sold you the flour. Meanwhile, across town, across the country, 2.5 million high school girls are bent over written homemaking exams in gymnasium chairs, competing for the All-American Homemaker of Tomorrow scholarship. The test covers meal planning, sewing, and household budgeting. It does not cover the lathe. It does not cover the factory floor number that was yours. The top prize is $10,000, which is generous and is also a scholarship to learn more homemaking. Nobody at General Mills pauses on this. The factory was the detour. The kitchen is the destination. Betty Crocker agrees warmly, from every direction at once. You bake something sweet most days now, because the books quietly assume you will. There is a cake section, a pie section, a cookie section, and they are not framed as occasional treats but as the ordinary furniture of a household. Tuesday earns a dessert the same as Sunday does. The cake mixes make it effortless, so the effortlessness becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a steady quantity of sugar moving through your family that no one anywhere is measuring out loud. You frost the cake. You stopped thinking of it as a special occasion some time ago, because by now, nothing about it is special. The cake mix arrived in 1947, and the original version required nothing but water. Open the box, pour it in, stir, bake, done. Women didn't buy it. Not because they couldn't be bothered, they could absolutely be bothered, but because it felt like cheating, like you hadn't made anything. Like the cake was the box's achievement and you were just the person who operated the oven. Ernest Dichter is a psychologist, not a baker. General Mills hired him to figure out why the mix wasn't moving, and he came back with an answer. Remove the powdered egg. Make women crack a fresh one into the bowl. Give them something to contribute. One small, real action between opening the box and calling it homemade. It worked immediately. The mix sold. The fresh egg didn't change the cake in any meaningful way. It changed how the baker felt about the cake, which is basically the some assembly required sticker on an IKEA shelf, except the assembly was emotional and the shelf was a lie about effort. The instruction is still on the box today. It never left. Meanwhile, the sugar is accumulating. Not dramatically. Not in a way you'd track. A slice here after dinner, a cookie with lunch, a square of something warm on a cold afternoon in January when the windows are iced over and the oven is the only reason the kitchen is habitable. By 1950, the average American is consuming roughly 95 pounds of sugar a year. By 1970, it's over 100. The climb is gradual enough that nobody announces it. Nobody writes it on a box. The Betty Crocker kitchens are not particularly worried about this. The Golden Valley kitchens are testing and adjusting and perfecting, and their job is not to ask whether you need a dessert today. Their job is to make sure that if you're going to make one, and you are, because the book assumes you will, it turns out well, uses gold medal flour, and leaves you wanting to make it again. The recipe works backward from the product. The cake is the point. The flour is the reason. Marguerite Sen carries a clipboard through Test Kitchen C and tastes a yellow layer cake from the rack, even, tender, and faintly engineered, makes a note with a pencil already short from use, and moves on without comment. The cake is good. The cake is always good. The cake is engineered to be good. The cookbooks don't mention cardiovascular science. Nobody's lying. Cardiovascular science, as a coherent public framework, is still being argued over in journals most people will never read. But the silence is very comfortable for flour sales, and comfort tends to persist. The 1950 picture cookbook has a dessert chapter that opens with the confidence of someone who has never been asked a hard question. The recipes are tested. The portions are generous. The assumption is that you'll be back. You will be back. The box is already on the shelf. You read the cookbook nearly cover to cover, and there is no warning in it anywhere. No note about the sugar. No mention of the studies just beginning to circulate about hearts and arteries and what a steady river of refined flour and white sugar might do to either. The book is sure of itself in a way that feels a great deal like care, and you accept the sureness, because why would the most trusted woman in America leave something important out of her own book? You turn the page to the frosting chapter. What she isn't telling you isn't printed anywhere you'd think to look. The studies do exist, though. By the mid-1950s, researchers are beginning to ask questions about dietary fat, sugar, and cardiovascular disease. The questions don't make it into the cookbook. They don't make it into the radio program, or the test kitchen press releases, or the cheerful insert tucked inside the cake mix box. The cookbook has opinions about buttercream. The cardiovascular literature does not get a chapter. The fictional character is genuinely useful to the company here. A real nutritionist with her name on a book can be contradicted. A real home economist who signs her recipes can be called to account. Betty Crocker can't. She's a signature on a reply card from 1921, grown into a face, grown into a voice, grown into 30,000 square feet of test kitchens in Golden Valley, Minnesota. The accountability stops at the edge of the portrait, and the portrait has been repainted 7 times. The frosting chapter contains butter. It contains powdered sugar. It contains a quantity of both that would cause a cardiologist in 2025 to put the book down quietly and leave the room without making eye contact. The recipe is cheerful about this. The headnote calls the result cloud-like. That cloud is about a pound of sugar per 9-inch cake. Not announced, just measured. Meanwhile, Ansel Keys is publishing his early work on saturated fat and heart disease. The American Heart Association will issue its first dietary guidelines by 1961. None of this is urgent enough to interrupt the bundt cake. The Betty Crocker kitchens are staffed by trained women, careful testers, professionals whose entire working day is food science, and not one of them is employed to put a warning on the label. That isn't their job. Their job is to find the next use for gold medal flour, which is basically a Netflix autoplay countdown, except the next thing queued up is always more flour, and the binge is making your aorta nervous. A home economist named Bernice, third desk from the window, the one who keeps a measuring cup in her cardigan pocket like a field tool, slides a typed recipe across the table for review. The chocolate layer cake, 3 cups of sugar between the batter and the frosting. Bernice knows what 3 cups of sugar is. She went to school for this. The recipe is approved. Bernice's name doesn't go on it. Betty Crocker's does. The 1980s bring a rebrand. The words light and easy start appearing on packaging. Fat is reduced. This is presented as listening, as the brand evolving, staying current, caring about you in the way a trusted woman would. The sugar stays. In several products, the sugar goes up, because fat removal requires compensation and sugar is cheap and effective. The rebrand is less a nutritional correction and more a label adjustment, the corporate equivalent of rearranging the furniture and calling it a renovation. You don't know any of this while you're reading. The cookbook doesn't offer it. It offers a full-page photograph of a glazed pound cake on a white ceramic stand, golden, glistening, and impossibly composed, backlit in the warm amber specific to General Mills food photography in 1968. And it is genuinely beautiful. The cake has no agenda you can see. That's the whole point of beautiful things. You dog-ear the page. You are an actress, and for 35 years your steady job is to be her voice. When women across the country hear Betty Crocker speak, they are hearing you, your timing, your warmth, your knack for making a sentence about gelatin sound like genuine reassurance. You are good at it. You are also entirely replaceable, and you know it, because the voice belongs to the company and not to your throat. You step up to the microphone. You become a woman who isn't there, for an audience that believes in her completely, and then the broadcast ends and you go home and you are simply yourself again. The woman who does this most famously is Adelaide Hawley Cumming, and she does it from 1924 to 1959, 35 years. At peak, the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air reaches an estimated 7 million listeners a week, which is roughly the population of Switzerland, all of them waiting to hear you explain what to do with a cup of gold medal flour. Adelaide adjusts the script on the music stand in front of her, smooths the edge of the page with 2 fingers, and becomes someone else on cue. She is punctual about it. The transformation happens between one breath and the next. The voice is not Adelaide's. It is the company's, borrowed back the moment the broadcast ends. The letters arrive by the hundreds, then the thousands. Real women writing to a radio voice they trust, about things that have nothing to do with cake, a marriage that's going wrong, a household budget that won't stretch, a mother-in-law with strong opinions about gravy. They write because Betty sounds like someone who would understand, and someone who would understand sounds like Adelaide, and Adelaide is standing in a recording studio in Minneapolis holding a script she didn't write. A staff of home economists composes the replies and signs them in Betty's name. The whole operation is basically a customer service chatbot, except every response is typed by a real woman pretending to be a woman who was never real to begin with. The letters are sincere. That's the part that stays with you. Nobody is being naive. They simply heard a warm voice on a Tuesday afternoon, and warmth is warmth regardless of the source. One woman writes that she's been making the brown sugar glaze every Sunday since 1931, and that it reminds her of her mother, and she wanted Betty to know. Betty doesn't know. Betty can't know. A home economist named Doris reads the letter, pauses, and writes back on company letterhead. Doris has been doing this since before the war. The radio show goes national by 1927, 3 years in. This is not a small production. There are scripts, rehearsals, a program structure that treats cooking instruction like drama, which it partly is, because the goal was never purely to teach. The goal is to keep General Mills flour relevant to 7 million households a week, and to do it through a voice that sounds like the most capable woman you've ever met. The show runs 5 days a week in some markets. Adelaide arrives. She reads. She leaves. The woman she plays does not. Of course, Adelaide is one name on a longer list. Other actresses take the microphone in regional markets, reading the same scripts, delivering the same warmth on cue, none of their names attached to the broadcasts in any permanent way. The voice is interchangeable. The persona is not. The persona is the asset. And the persona belongs to the company, and the company is General Mills. And General Mills is very clear on this point. Your name is not on the asset. Your voice is in it, briefly, and then it isn't. By 1959, the role migrates to television. The warm intimacy of radio, the oven-adjacent voice arriving through a speaker while you stood at a kitchen counter, becomes the crisp, polished, and relentlessly bright confidence of early television ads. The kitchen looks cleaner on screen than any real kitchen ever gets. The woman looks composed in a way that requires several people working off camera to maintain. Adelaide steps back. The microphone gets replaced by a camera, and the camera has opinions about everything. You are a trained home economist, and you are qualified, and you are not being hired into these kitchens because the kitchens do not hire women who look like you. The cookbooks know only white hands. The radio knows only white voices. The advertisements picture a country that has quietly settled who counts as a homemaker and who does not. And the settling was done without anyone needing to say it out loud. You fill out the application anyway. The application has no box on it that will help you, and everyone who reads it understands precisely why and says nothing. The Golden Valley kitchens are at their peak in the 1960s. They test recipes across acres of white appliances and clean countertops. The counter surfaces are smooth, bright, and aggressively clean. The photographs of those countertops, and the women at them, contain a very specific palette of colours, and yours is not among them. That omission costs you something specific. You have the degree. Some of you have 2 degrees. You can calculate conversion ratios and identify the protein structure of gluten under heat. You know what Maillard browning is, and why it matters and at what temperature it stops. None of this is the issue. The issue is that the brand has decided what a homemaker looks like, and the brand drew that decision in 1936 using a composite of faces from its own staff, and none of those faces looked like yours either. A woman named Clara, sitting 3 rows behind you in your food science cohort, gets the callback. Clara is excellent at her job. This is not about Clara. Clara goes to Golden Valley and tests a tuna casserole that contains nothing that was ever alive recently. It photographs beautifully. The cookbooks through the 1940s and 1950s do not picture you. Not once. Not in passing. Not in the back of a crowd scene. The kitchens, the tablecloths, the hands holding the spoon over the pot, all of it speaks a consistent language, and the language says this room belongs to someone specific. By the time the language shifts in the late 1960s, it shifts because outside pressure has made silence too loud to maintain, not because anyone inside the building woke up one morning and reconsidered. The 1996 portrait, 75 years after the brand began, was the first image designed to suggest racial diversity. It was a digital composite of 75 American women. 75 women, blended into one face. None of them named. The brand's answer to decades of hiring nobody who looked like you was, essentially, a software merge. The corporate version of dragging 75 photos into Photoshop, lowering the opacity, and calling the result a community. The technique was identical to 1936, except this time the composite was very specifically designed to look like progress, and it was announced as such, and it appeared on the cover of a cookbook. The woman who answered your application, which is to say the woman who didn't answer it, because there was no woman, there was a department, sent a reply in Betty Crocker's friendly handwriting. The reply thanked you for your interest. The reply said the position had been filled. The reply was signed with a name that belonged to nobody, which meant nobody was responsible, which meant the conversation was over before it began. You keep the letter anyway. It's printed on very nice stationery. You start seeing cereal turn up in the recipes, which is new. A pie crust made of crushed flakes, a casserole bound together with the same cereal your children eat from cartoon boxes at breakfast. The brand has more than flour to sell now, and so the recipes quietly widen to make room, the way a guest list widens when someone turns out to have cousins. You press the cornflake topping down onto the dish, Your children watch a puffed, sugared cereal sold to them by a cartoon, and no one in the kitchen connects the two boxes, because they were never meant to be connected. General Mills doesn't just make flour, it makes Wheaties, Cheerios, Kix. It makes the boxes with the cartoon animals and the sports heroes and the prizes buried somewhere near the bottom. And now those boxes need recipes too, which means Betty Crocker needs recipes for them, which means the Betty Crocker kitchens in Golden Valley are testing what happens when you grind Wheaties into a crust and fill it with something warm. The answer, it turns out, is it holds together. The kitchens note this down. Somewhere a product manager nods. The casserole was already a sealed system. Canned tuna and whatever held it together, nothing in it that had seen daylight recently. Now the cereal arrives on top as a topping, crisp, golden, and faintly sugared. A finishing move. The casserole is already doing a lot of work. It is binding together proteins and starches and condensed sodium and calling the result dinner. Adding a cereal crown doesn't change its nature. It just makes it crunchier. Marlene, age 9, eats the cornflake topping off first and considers the rest a loss. She isn't wrong. The recipe's cross-promoting cereal have a logic the cookbook doesn't state out loud. Cheerios appear in a party mix. Kix appear in a candy cluster. Wheaties appear in the crust of something described as festive. Each recipe requires a box. Each box costs 39 cents. You buy 2 because the recipe calls for 2 cups and the box contains 3. And what are you supposed to do with 1 cup of Kix? Exactly. The kitchens have anticipated this. The kitchens have always anticipated this. The children's cereal angle is doing something the flour angle couldn't quite do. It enters the kitchen twice. It comes in through the breakfast cabinet in the morning, poured into a bowl by small hands that haven't fully woken up yet. Then it comes in through the recipe card in the afternoon, measured out and crushed with the heel of your hand. The same product. 2 occasions. The brand is now billing itself for 2 meals without technically advertising at all. It's just a recipe. It's just a suggestion. It's just something to do with what you already have. And you do already have it, because the children asked for it, because the cartoon told them to ask, because the cartoon has been on television every Saturday morning since roughly the invention of Saturday morning television. The loop is tidy. The loop doesn't need to announce itself. The home economists in the kitchens understand what they're developing. They test the recipes thoroughly. They make the cornflake crust 7 times before the texture is right. They note which cereals hold their structure under heat and which ones turn to something resembling warm paste. This is real work, careful work, documented across pages of test notes that will never carry their names. The recipe will say Betty Crocker. The crust will say Wheaties. The box will say General Mills. Somewhere in that chain, the women who figured out the ratios disappear entirely, the way flour disappears into batter, present in the structure, invisible in the result. You buy the mix because it saves you time. And it does save you time. And it also costs more than the flour and sugar it quietly replaces. You don't sit down and run the numbers, because running the numbers was never the point. The point is the box, the ease, the modern feeling of opening rather than measuring. But the grocery bill is heavier than your mother's ever was, and the difference is going somewhere, steadily, to the company that sold you the ease. You load the cart. The convenience is real, and so is the markup, and only one of the 2 is printed on the front. A cake mix box, in 1950, cost 39 cents. Which sounds like nothing until you remember that baking the same cake from scratch, flour, sugar, a little fat, runs you less. The mix is more expensive than the thing it replaced. And it replaced it anyway, because the box has a picture of a cake on it, tall, glossy, and improbably perfect, that looks better than any cake you've actually made. The box does that. It promises a version of the cake that exists only in Golden Valley, Minnesota, under controlled conditions, photographed with lighting your kitchen doesn't have. The home economists in the Golden Valley kitchens understood this perfectly. All of them developing recipes backward, starting with a product that needed moving and working toward the dish that would move it. Not what would taste good, but what would use more Bisquick. D. The recipes were engineering solutions to an inventory problem. Delicious, many of them. That's not the point. The point is the direction of the math. Meredith, one of the test kitchen staff, adjusts a timer with 2 fingers and doesn't look up. She's on her fourth iteration of a casserole that calls for a full can of condensed soup and a cup of gold medal flour in the topping. The casserole works. It will work in 400,000 home kitchens across 12 states. Her name won't be on it. Bisquick arrived in 1931, reverse-engineered from a dining car chef's premix and sold as labor-saving. It was also, more precisely, a way to prop up flour sales during the Depression when nobody was buying flour in the quantities General Mills preferred. The convenience pitch was real. The flour pitch was realer. You bought both simultaneously and called it progress. And the add an egg line, still on the box right now, in whatever year you're reading it, that's a 1940s guilt management solution that never got retired. The original cake mixes needed only water. Women didn't buy them. A psychologist named Ernest Dichter told the company why. The mix felt like cheating. Too easy. Nothing contributed. So the powdered egg came out, and a fresh egg went in. And suddenly the transaction felt earned. One egg, cracked over a bowl, and the guilt resolves. It's basically the some assembly required on flat-pack furniture, except the assembly is emotional and the furniture is a birthday cake. Sugar consumption climbed through all of this quietly. Around £95 per person per year in 1950, closer to 102 by 1970. The cardiovascular science was accumulating in the same decades. The Betty Crocker cookbooks carried none of it. No warning, no footnote, no suggestion. The box just says, delicious. You are older now, and the new book promises something called light cooking, and you buy it because your doctor has started using the word cholesterol in your direction. You follow the lighter recipes faithfully. Less butter. Fewer eggs. You feel responsible, modern, looked after. What you don't notice, because it is never pointed out, is that the sugar stayed and the white flour stayed, and in a few recipes both crept upward to cover the difference. The book has rebranded itself around your fear without quite addressing the thing you're afraid of. You serve the light version. It is lighter in exactly the way that changes nothing. The 1980s food industry understood fear, and what it understood was that fear is an excellent reason to buy a new book. The word cholesterol had broken through into living room language by the early 1980s, and the American Heart Association was generating headlines that could not be ignored, and General Mills had a brand to protect. The solution was not to revise the recipes toward genuine nutrition. The solution was to revise the cover. The Betty Crocker lineup pivoted to light and easy messaging with the calm confidence of a company that has done this before, which it had, 7 times, with a face. The fat came down. The labels said so. A home economist named Carol adjusts her reading glasses and crosses out 2 tablespoons butter and writes 1, feels the satisfaction of a job done carefully. What Carol's revision doesn't touch is the cup of white flour, or the 3/4 cup of granulated sugar, or the half cup of corn syrup the recipe has always called for, because corn syrup is what makes the texture work, and the texture is what makes you buy the mix again. Carol is doing her job exactly as asked. The job just wasn't about your cholesterol. No book in the series ever carried a nutritional advisory, and this one didn't either. The light and easy pivot was the same as every previous pivot, warm, friendly, and pointing away from the ingredient that needed protecting. Meanwhile, cardiovascular research was producing uncomfortable reading for anyone paying attention. By the mid-1980s, the link between refined carbohydrates and metabolic health sat in a peer-reviewed journal on a desk somewhere, unread in Golden Valley, a long way from any living room. The cookbooks did not engage with this. They engaged with fat, because fat was the target the industry had agreed on, and the low-fat consensus was enormously convenient for companies whose core product was refined flour and refined sugar. Cutting fat and keeping sugar is, nutritionally, the equivalent of removing the car's spare tire and calling it a diet. The car is lighter. The car is not safer. You finish the light cake. It's good. It's always good. The kitchen smells like caramelized sugar and warm vanilla and something vaguely responsible, and you think about your doctor's appointment next month with cautious optimism. The Betty Crocker New International Cookbook sits on the shelf next to the light and easy volume, both of them cheerful. Both of them photographed in that particular shade of aspirational natural light, soft, golden, and quietly forgiving, that makes a bundt cake look like a solution to something. You are not being deceived, exactly. You are being accompanied, very warmly, in a direction that was chosen before you arrived. You open the newest edition and find a section you've never seen before, labelled International, full of dishes from places the older books behaved as though no one cooked in. They are presented as small adventures, a little exotic, a little daring, an excursion away from the real food, which is still quietly assumed to be the casserole and the white bread. You try one of the recipes. It has been adjusted, smoothed, made unthreatening for a kitchen like yours. The cuisines of your own neighbours arrive in your home as polite guests who've been told to keep their voices down, decades after they were already cooking better than this a few doors away. The Italian recipe calls for canned tomatoes, garlic powder, and a suggested substitution if the pasta shape is unavailable. The Mexican one involves a packet of something. The Chinese one requires no wok and specifically notes that a regular skillet works just fine, which is technically true and also misses the point in the way that a regular office chair technically works just fine as a saddle. These are the flavours of 50 years of neighbours and co-workers and corner shop owners, arriving now, in 1970, via a softcover chapter with a globe on the cover. An international section in a General Mills cookbook means something specific. It means someone in the Golden Valley kitchens sat down and figured out how to route a dish through gold medal flour before it reached you. The chicken doesn't become Taiwanese. The chicken becomes a vehicle for a thickened sauce that calls for a heaping tablespoon of the right product. The dish travels across an ocean, and the flour travels 12 inches from your pantry shelf to your pan. Rosario Mendez, a home economics teacher in San Antonio, flips to the Mexican section with the specific alertness of someone expecting to find themselves described incorrectly. She finds a casserole. She turns the page. There is another casserole. She closes the book with the quiet precision of someone returning a library book they did not enjoy. The headnotes call it adventurous and tell you to try something different, which positions you as an explorer, and an explorer implies territory nobody had reached yet. But you are not the first to reach it. The territory had been settled for 60 years before you opened the chapter. Italian-American kitchens had been running that whole time. Chinese-American restaurants were a fixture in virtually every mid-sized American city before Betty Crocker had a signature. Eastern European home cooks had been stuffing, braising, and fermenting through the Midwest since before the Washburn Mill sent its first flour bag puzzle out into the world. The international section doesn't discover these cuisines. It discovers that enough white Midwestern households might now buy them. The 1996 portrait update made her face a composite of 75 women from across the country, the first image gesturing toward racial diversity, 75 years in. The international cookbook sections in your hands arrived earlier than that, technically, which is the kind of head start that counts for almost nothing. The chapter is still titled like a passport stamp rather than a neighbourhood. The recipes are not the only thing adjusted, though. You read the headnote first, and the headnote is where the real work happens. Each dish gets 2 or 3 sentences of gentle anthropology. Here is where this food is from. Here is the occasion it is traditionally served at. Here is the one cultural fact that makes it feel manageable. The headnotes do the work a border crossing used to do. They process the unfamiliar into something tidy, mild, and reassuringly familiar that can sit comfortably next to your tuna casserole without causing concern. By the time you've finished reading, the dish has already been issued a visitor's visa and asked to behave. When you cook the adjusted version, what's missing is the loud part. The spice level softens. The fermented elements turn optional or vanish. The cooking method that wanted a different tool gets simplified into one already in your drawer. The dish you end up plating is related to its origin, the way a studio apartment is related to the building it's in. Same address. Completely different experience. The real cuisines of your real neighbours were never dangerous. They were inconvenient to ingredients a flour company needed to sell. You save the box tops and the coupons and the little printed proofs of purchase because the company has built a whole small economy of rewards and you are a citizen of it. Send in enough and a pamphlet arrives, or a measuring spoon, or a special recipe booklet stamped with her name. You cut carefully along the dotted line so the edge stays clean. It is a relationship conducted entirely by mail, your loyalty traded for premiums, and it feels a good deal like belonging to something warm. You drop the envelope in the box. The warmth is real to you, and on the other end of the mail it is a ledger. The premium economy isn't accidental, it's a precision instrument. Each redeemed box top represents a household that has gone back to the store, selected the right brand from the shelf, and done it again and again until the habit is sealed. You're not a customer at that point so much as a subscriber, except nobody used that word yet, and there's no cancel button, and the terms of service are printed in friendly cursive on the back of a recipe card. The pamphlet arrives thin, glossy, and printed on good stock, maybe 12 pages, and the photographs are in colour, and she is on the cover, composed and smiling and wearing something sensible. Inside, there are 6 recipes, and 5 of them involve gold medal flour. The 6th involves Bisquick, which is also flour, assembled differently, in a box that costs more than flour. The measuring spoon is real. It's metal. It has her name on the handle. Muriel Hendricks in Duluth keeps hers in the drawer with the good utensils. She has had it 17 years. She has no idea who made it. The letters work on the same architecture. You write to Betty, and people do write to Betty, personally, in longhand, about the pound cake that fell in the middle, about whether a daughter who won't eat is a phase or something more, and something comes back. Signed. Warm. Specific enough to feel personal. A home economist named Dorothy or Patricia or Jean sat down at a typewriter and wrote it, and then signed a name that wasn't hers, and then did it again. The reply smells like paper and good intentions. It is also, structurally, a customer retention letter. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The premium isn't the measuring spoon. The premium is the feeling that you are known, that someone on the other end has registered your existence as a person and not a unit. Companies in the 1990s will spend enormous sums trying to reproduce this with loyalty cards, frequent flyer tiers, and personalization algorithms, and most of them will fail to approximate what a staff of overworked, underpaid home economists managed with a typewriter and a pile of form letters in 1952. The letters worked because they sounded like a friend. The friend wasn't there, but the sound of her was very well made. Of course, the box tops also solve a distribution problem. If you're cutting box tops, you've already bought the box. If you're saving them, you need more boxes. The pamphlet you receive in return contains a recipe that requires you to buy another box. The measuring spoon, balanced lightly in your palm, is the physical form of a loop that has no intended exit. A souvenir of a shopping habit, stamped with her name, sitting in Muriel's drawer for 17 years, which is 17 years of gold medal flour. You send in the envelope. It costs you a stamp and a clean cut along the dotted line. What it costs the company is the pamphlet, the postage, and the labour of the woman who typed your reply and signed a name she wasn't allowed to keep. You were promised the machine would give you your time back, and the stand mixer does take the ache out of your arm, the heavy, steady thud of it doing the beating you used to do by hand. But the time it saves has a way of filling itself back in immediately. Another cake, a second batch, a slightly more ambitious menu, because now, after all, you can. The standard for a good homemaker quietly rises to meet the new convenience. You lock the bowl into place. The labour you saved this morning has somehow already been spent on more labour by noon. This is not an accident. The Golden Valley kitchens were not really a test kitchen at all. They were a small factory floor where the product being manufactured is the idea that you should want to cook more. The economists there developed recipes the way a defense contractor develops a product, starting from what needed to be moved off a shelf, working backward towards something that tasted like a reason to buy it. If gold medal flour needed a sales quarter, there was a new cake. If Bisquick inventory ran high, there was a new variation on the shortcake. The kitchen was not built around your hunger. It was built around the warehouse. The mixer itself has a longer story than the kitchen does. KitchenAid introduced its home stand mixer in 1919. By the 1950s, it was appearing in Betty Crocker advertising as both aspirational object and moral proof. A woman with a good mixer was a woman who took this seriously. The machine gleamed, heavy, polished, and faintly ceremonial. White enamel, chrome fixtures, the kind of object that sat on a counter and quietly implied a whole lifestyle around it. You don't own this appliance. This appliance owns the kind of person you're supposed to become. Meanwhile, the recipes multiplying around that mixer had a consistent geometry. Most called for 2 to 3 cups of gold medal flour. Many required a box of something, a mix, a prepared sauce, a canned component that happened to be made by a company General Mills had a friendly relationship with. Tuna noodle casserole, the period's most reliable weeknight staple, came almost entirely out of cans. The oven did the work, the mixer had the night off, The casserole had the structural ambition of a spreadsheet. And the 1950 Betty Crocker picture cookbook, $2.95 at the counter, 1 million copies in its first year, reflected all of this without once saying so. Every recipe was developed backward from a product that needed selling. The book read like a gift from a trusted friend who happened to live inside a flour mill. It felt warm. It felt personal. It felt like Betty, who did not exist, was standing just behind the page. Renata from the test group, a home economist who adjusted viscosity levels for the package frosting and then typed up the results in a tone of enthusiastic discovery, will not appear in any edition of the book. She hands you the recipe on page 47 anyway, smoothing the corner of the card with 2 fingers like she's sending off a small embassy. By the 1960s, the average American household was producing more baked goods per week than the previous generation, with significantly more convenience product in the mix and a net increase in the amount of time women spent in the kitchen. The labor-saving device had functioned, accurately, as a labor-expanding one. This is basically what happens every time a new productivity app is released and everyone ends up in twice as many meetings, except the meetings involved a bunt pan. The standard rises. It always rises. The mixer hums. You start on the second batch. You have 2 authorities in your kitchen now, and they don't always agree. There is your mother, who cooks by feel and memory and the occasional sharp correction over your shoulder, and there is Betty, who cooks by card and box and a confidence your mother never once claimed for herself. When the 2 conflict, you find yourself siding with the card, because the card is printed, and printed somehow feels like proof. Your mother watches you measure out something she would have judged by eye. A small thing passes between you across the counter. You are choosing a woman who doesn't exist over the one standing right there, and you both feel it land. It is 1953 in a kitchen in Minneapolis, and the 2 of them are standing 3 feet apart, and only one of them is real. Your mother is at the gas range, the blue ring of flame turned down by 1/8 of a turn she has never once measured. Betty is on the counter, a recipe card propped against the flour canister, clean, certain, and unsmudged, so you can read her while your hands are busy. The card does not move. It does not sigh. It does not reach past you to fix the thing you are about to do wrong. This, you decide, is restraint, and you prefer it. Watch your mother make a white sauce. She does not look at the flour going into the pan. She knows the amount the way she knows the height of the back step. She tilts the canister, taps it twice with 1 knuckle, and stops. If you asked her how much, she would say, enough, which is not a number you can write down. She tastes from the wooden spoon, adds salt from her cupped hand, tastes again. The whole performance takes 90 seconds and produces a sauce that has never failed in 40 years and has never once been recorded. Now watch the card. The card says 2 tablespoons. The card says exactly. It has a confidence your mother retired around her 2nd decade at a stove, because she has been wrong enough to respect the ways a sauce can break, and the card has never been wrong because the card has never cooked anything. Betty has a test kitchen and a staff of home economists whose names are on nothing, and not one of them is standing in your kitchen, and that is exactly what makes her easy to trust. She is the friend who has never seen you fail because she has never seen you at all. You level the 2 tablespoons against the rim with a butter knife, the way the card implies you should, the way your mother never has in her life. She watches you do it. She does not say anything. She has noticed that you trust the printing more than the hand, and the noticing settles into her face for a second before she turns back to the range. It is the look of a woman being quietly replaced by a brochure. This is the thing about certainty. Your mother knew too much to be certain. She had seen the same recipe come out 4 different ways depending on the weather, the flour, the mood of the oven, and the certainty got sanded off her years ago, the way it does for anyone who does a thing long enough. Betty knows nothing and has no reason to doubt herself, which reads on a printed card as authority. It is the same trick the GPS pulls when it tells you, in a calm and pleasant voice, to drive into a lake. The calm is doing all the work, and you fall for it, gently, every time. The card is wiped clean of 100 batter splatters, the corner soft from handling. Your mother has flour on her forearm and 40 years of being right in a way nobody ever wrote down. You choose the card the way the whole country is choosing it, 1 tablespoon at a time, and the living woman 3 feet away keeps her own counsel and stirs the sauce she has already, quietly, fixed. You stand in the kitchen at 4:30 and the day's largest question arrives, dependable as the clock. What is for dinner? You have a husband home at 6 and children hungry now and a budget with firm opinions, and you have her, the card file, the index, the alphabetized solution to exactly this moment. You flip to the worn section near the front. She has a casserole for the nights you can't think, a quick bread for the nights you're behind, an answer pre-written for the precise shape of your panic. You pull a card. The panic is daily, and so, reliably, gratefully, is she. Consider the casserole. Not the casserole as a dish. The casserole as a product delivery mechanism wearing an apron. The card sends you to the cupboard, not the icebox, because everything it asks for comes out of a can. You don't measure anything fresh because there's nothing fresh to measure. The ingredients are shelf-stable, pre-salted, engineered to last until you need them. It'll feed 4, possibly 5, if the children aren't paying close attention. The recipe doesn't ask anything of you except that you open 3 cans and heat the oven. This is the point. The Golden Valley kitchens are white appliances and good lighting and a staff of home economists whose job is not, technically, to figure out what you should eat. Their job is to figure out what to do with gold medal flour and the other General Mills products that need moving off shelves. They start with the product. They work backwards towards something edible. The recipe is the solution the way a vending machine is the solution to hunger, accurate, available, and arranged entirely around what the supplier already has in stock. A home economist named Eleanor, dark-haired, sensible shoes, very good with roux, stands at a test counter and adjusts the ratio for the 3rd time this week. She writes the final version in clean, technical language. Somebody else translates it into the warm second person that sounds like Betty. Eleanor does not appear anywhere in the cookbook. The cookbook sells 1.2 million copies in its first year. The oven in Eleanor's test kitchen is already preheating for the next one. The card in your hand is a specific kind of object. You didn't choose this recipe because it's good, exactly. You chose it because it was chosen for you in advance. In 1949 or 1952 or 1958, by a woman you'll never meet working a job she'll never be credited for, cooking for a product portfolio rather than a family. She solved a procurement problem and called it dinner. You call it Tuesday. The casserole bakes for 35 minutes. The kitchen fills with the smell of cream of mushroom soup, which is a very particular smell, warm and starchy and institutional, like a school cafeteria that's been trying its best. You set the table. The clock moves towards 6. Outside it's whatever February does in Minneapolis, which is commit fully and without apology. The oven is the only warm thing in the room, and it's doing its best, and so are you, and the card in the recipe file never once mentioned that the recipe was also an invoice. The children eat without comment. This is a success. The husband says it's good. This is also a success. You wash the casserole dish and file the card back in its alphabetized place. Tomorrow is Wednesday, which means there's a different section. She's got that covered too. She's always got it covered. She has, after all, nothing else to do. You hand your daughter the children's edition, the one with her name on it sized down for small hands, and you teach the next cook the way you yourself were taught. She measures flour into a bowl, proud and careful and slow, and you correct her grip on the cup the way the book gently suggests. You are passing something down, and what you're passing down is partly love and partly a catalogue, a set of brand preferences installed early, before she's old enough to know that someone else chose them for her. She cracks her first egg badly into the bowl. You are raising a customer and a daughter at once, and they are the same small girl. The children's edition isn't the only one. There's the original picture cookbook on the counter, the one your mother gave you, still smelling faintly of vanilla extract and old paper. There's the binder your neighbour lent you in 1958 and never asked back. There's the spiral-bound one that came free with a KitchenAid purchase. By the time your daughter is old enough to have her own kitchen, she'll own 4 of them without ever making a single deliberate choice about it. The Betty Crocker library accumulates the way furniture does. It's just there one day. You watch what she's learning. She's learning, because you are teaching her, that gold medal flour is the correct flour, not because anyone has compared it to anything else, but because it's the only flour in every recipe she's ever seen you reach for. You point her to the low shelf where the Bisquick lives, the one small hands can reach. You show her that the right way to make a birthday cake involves a box, a bowl, 1 egg, and not too many questions. The egg is still in the recipe. It has always been in the recipe. Nobody's told her why, and she won't think to ask for another 40 years. Meanwhile, Across town, another daughter is doing the same thing, and across the state, and in the gymnasium of a high school where 2.5 million senior girls a year bent over a written homemaking exam, pencils moving across questions about leavening ratios and proper table settings, competing for a scholarship in Betty Crocker's name. The prize was $10,000. The subject was the house you didn't own yet. It was basically the SATs, except the only correct answer was gold medal flower. A girl named Ruth Ann, second row, good posture, dress pressed, finishes her exam early and sits with her hands folded. She studied for this. Her mother helped her study. Her mother used the book too. The transmission is invisible from inside it. Your daughter doesn't know she's being taught brand loyalty. You don't entirely know you're teaching it. You genuinely believe the cup measurement matters, that the sifting step is important, that this is how things are correctly done. The book told you so, in a warm and patient voice, and the voice seemed trustworthy because it always had. Trust is easiest to install in the first kitchen a person ever stands in. Betty Crocker understood this before your daughter was born. Betty Crocker understood this before you were born. The flour goes into the bowl. The egg follows. Your daughter stirs with a seriousness usually reserved for surgery. You watch her and feel something genuine, pride, tenderness, the specific pleasure of watching a small person do a careful thing. None of that is manufactured. The love in the room is entirely real. The brand preference is also entirely real. You are given a tour of the kitchens because the company likes to show them off, and they are genuinely impressive, gleaming, busy, staffed by women in crisp aprons doing real and careful work with stopwatches and scales. The tour tells you this is where good cooking is studied, and the studying is real. The part the tour leaves out is what the studying is for. You watch a woman time a cake to the second. She is rigorous, exact, plainly excellent at her job. She is also working from a list of products that need new uses, not a list of families that need feeding, and the difference never comes up. The Betty Crocker kitchens in Golden Valley, Minnesota cover 30,000 square feet. That's roughly the size of a small department store and bigger than several schools. It could rent itself out as a museum, and nobody would question the square footage. It is, at its 1960s peak, staffed by roughly 50 home economists, real women with real credentials, trained in food science, nutrition, recipe development, and technique. Their names appear on nothing that leaves the building. What leaves the building is Betty's name. A recipe here doesn't start with hunger, or with a gap in what American families are eating well. It starts with a product that's sitting in the warehouse moving too slowly. Someone upstairs has a quota problem with gold medal flour. Someone else has a surplus of Bisquick. The home economists are handed the ingredient and pointed at the kitchen, and their considerable skill is applied to the question, what can we build around this? The recipe is the answer. The answer ships as a cookbook. A home economist named Mabel, she works the baking station nearest the window, adjusts the oven temperature by 5 degrees, notes the result in a logbook, adjusts again. She's done this 47 times this week. The logbook is neat, precise, and faintly devotional. The logbook belongs to General Mills. Mabel does not get a byline. The 30,000 square feet is a different kind of space than the tour implies. It's not a research kitchen in the way a university laboratory is a research kitchen, where the question drives the outcome. It's more like a reverse engineering facility, except the engineering is emotional, and the women inside it are very good at their jobs. The tour guide, a cheerful woman with a clipboard, stops in front of a row of identical ovens. She explains that every recipe is tested a minimum of 4 times before publication. She is not exaggerating. The rigor is genuine. A cake that fails once gets made again from scratch. Same measurements, same flour, same pan, the wax paper pressed flat along the bottom crease with the same thumb pressure. You could eat anything that comes out of this kitchen. It would be good. It would also contain, at some structural level, a specific amount of gold medal flour, because that's what the brief required before the testing began. Of course, the tour doesn't put it that way. The tour puts it as dedication, which it is. Both things are true at once, and the kitchens are very clean, and nobody says the second thing out loud. By the early 1960s, the kitchens are producing roughly 1,200 tested recipes per year. Not all of them make it into print. The ones that make it are the ones that showcase a General Mills product at a frequency that justifies the product's shelf placement. A recipe that happens to call for only butter and eggs and a little common sense flour doesn't make the shortlist. A recipe that opens with 2 cups of gold medal and proceeds from there has a better chance. The math isn't spoken. Everyone in the room already knows it. Mabel adjusts the oven one more time. 4 degrees. She writes it down. The cake is for a campaign tied to the spring baking season, which is a season General Mills invented, in the sense that no season is naturally about baking more than another. But late February needs a sales bump. The cake will be excellent. The campaign will reach 6 million homes. Mabel's name will not. You are newly married and the cookbook arrives almost as part of the wedding itself, a starter manual for the life you've just stepped into. You don't yet know how to run a kitchen, and she does, and so you defer to her on everything from the roast to the correct way to set a table for company. The book assumes you'll be doing all of this alone, every day, forever, and it assumes it so cheerfully and so completely that you never once think to question the assumption. You open to the first chapter. Your education in being a wife begins, written for you by a woman who has never won. The 1950 Betty Crocker picture cookbook retails for $2.95, which in 1950 is roughly what a movie ticket and popcorn cost together. It is not cheap. It is also not exactly a cookbook in the way that implies free judgment. It is a curriculum. The chapters unfold in order of domestic duty: quick breads, yeast breads, cakes, cookies, pies. Gold medal flour appears in the ingredient list the way oxygen appears in air. It's just there. It doesn't announce itself. It simply cannot be removed. The recipes themselves are not designed for your body, your schedule, or your taste. They are designed backward from a warehouse of flour that needs moving before the quarter closes. A home economist in Golden Valley sat down with a product quota and found the meal to justify it. You sit down with the result and find dinner. The distance between those 2 rooms is the entire width of the book, and nobody mentions it. The pages are glossy and illustrated in colours slightly too saturated to look real, the aspic mould too perfect, the layer cake too symmetrical, the roast too uniformly golden. Connie, the woman in your building who got the same edition at her own wedding 3 years earlier, says her copy fell open automatically to the white cake page by 1953 because she'd made it so many times the spine gave up. The spine knew. You will too. Of course, the book doesn't just contain recipes. It contains a posture. There are sections on how to greet your husband at the door when dinner is late. There are notes on portion planning for company that assume company arrives on your husband's schedule, not yours. There's a small illustration of a woman, rounded, pleasant, and faintly maternal, vaguely resembling the portrait on the cover, standing at a counter with an expression suggesting she has never once wished she were somewhere else. She's convincing. She's been redrawn several times to stay convincing. The woman in the illustration doesn't exist, and the author on the cover doesn't exist, and yet together they have organized your entire day. The cake mixes are newer, introduced in 1947. They cost 39 cents a box, which is often more than making the same cake from the ingredients already on your shelf. The economics don't especially add up, but the box has clear instructions and a warm photograph and one specific line that turns out to be doing a great deal of work. Add 1 egg. You add the egg. You feel you have contributed. A man named Ernest Dichter advised General Mills to leave the powdered egg out and let the woman crack a fresh one herself. And General Mills did, and the line is still on the box right now, wherever you are. The freshest thing in the batter is the guilt it was engineered to prevent. The book sold over 1 million copies in its first year. By 2000, the series moves past 65 million total, which makes it one of the best-selling cookbook franchises in American history and also one of the longest-running advertisements in American history. Those 2 facts are the same fact. Nobody puts that on the cover. You watch her arrive on television, and she is different there, brighter, cooler, surrounded by white appliances that gleam under lights your own kitchen will never see. On the radio, she had been a voice beside you. On the screen, she becomes an image ahead of you, a standard to climb toward rather than a friend to cook alongside. The commercials are short and crisp and very certain of themselves. You find yourself sitting a little straighter while you watch them. The intimacy has quietly turned into aspiration, and the woman who used to murmur in your ear now smiles down at you from a kitchen plainly nicer than yours. That kitchen isn't a kitchen, it's a set. Every surface is wiped clean before the cameras roll, and the oven door has never had a handprint on it, and the measuring cups are dry, because nobody has used them yet. The refrigerator hums in the background like a hired extra. Your refrigerator hums too, but yours hums in a key that suggests mild anxiety about the compressor. The white appliances are doing a specific kind of work here. They aren't just appliances. They're the argument. They say, the right woman in the right kitchen, with the right products, produces this. Whatever this gleaming, effortless, fluorescent lit result is. You absorb the argument without knowing you're absorbing it, which is generally how the best arguments work. Meanwhile, behind the television set and several states to the left, the Golden Valley kitchens have a room full of home economists doing things in the opposite order. They start with a product, gold medal flour, say, or a new Bisquick variation that's been sitting in the pipeline since Tuesday, and then they find a recipe that needs it, not the other way around. The recipe is the solution to a sales problem, not a food problem. It is, if you squint, the same arrangement as a free sample at the grocery store, where the kindness and the inventory problem are the identical gesture. A home economist named Marion sets a timer. The timer doesn't trust her. She sets it anyway. She's been doing this since 8 in the morning, and it's now 2:30, and the third cake variation of the day is in the oven, and the notes she's writing will be published under the name of a woman who has never held a spatula. Marion's handwriting is very neat. Nobody will know that. The television version diverges most sharply from the radio version, not in what she says, but in what you're now expected to feel about your own kitchen while she says it. On the radio, the gap between her kitchen and yours was invisible because nobody could see either one. On television, the gap is the whole point. Aspiration needs distance to function. You can't aspire upward towards something standing right next to you. Of course, the fictional woman on your screen doesn't know she's fictional. She can't know that. She smiles with the placid certainty of someone who has never once burned a roux or misread a tablespoon as a teaspoon or discovered at 8:15 on a Tuesday that she is out of baking powder. She is serene in the way that only people who don't actually cook can afford to be serene. The performance is flawless. It's flawless because it isn't a performance of cooking. It's a performance of confidence about cooking. Those are different skills, and only one of them requires an actual oven. Your oven, for the record, has an opinion about all of this. The spring on the door announces your intentions to the whole house every time you open it. The burner on the left runs slightly hot. You know this. You've adjusted. Betty Crocker has never adjusted for anything in her life, because nothing has ever gone wrong in her kitchen, because her kitchen exists only when the cameras are running. The commercials end. The program returns. You get up to check on dinner. You grow old, and she does not. The women whose faces built her portrait grow old and pass and stay uncredited to the very end. The home economists retire one by one. The voice on the radio is quietly replaced. You yourself begin to slow down at the stove. She stays. She moves from radio to television to whatever comes after. The same age she has always been, the same warmth, the same certainty, selling the same company's products to your daughter, and one day to your daughter's daughter. You close the worn red book a final time. The most trusted woman in America was never going to die, because she was never once alive to begin with. Marjorie Child Husted runs the brand for 26 years. She earns roughly $20,000 a year at peak, which in today's terms sits somewhere around $250,000, one of the highest salaries commanded by any woman in American business through the 1940s. She writes the scripts, shapes the voice, builds the persona from a signature into a national institution. Her name appears nowhere on any of it. When she retires in 1950, Betty Crocker continues without interruption. Marjorie goes home. Betty doesn't have a home to go to. The portrait gets updated again and again. 7 times between 1936 and 1996. Each revision a quiet corporate decision. Soften the jaw, raise the collar, adjust the hair so she reads as contemporary rather than dated. A graphic designer named Sandra somewhere in Golden Valley submits color swatches. Nobody asks the women whose original faces went into the 1936 composite whether they'd like to be consulted. They wouldn't be anyway. They were never officially in the picture to begin with. The 1996 version goes further. It's a digital composite of 75 American women, assembled to suggest racial diversity for the first time in the brand's history. 75 years after the name was invented to sign flower contest replies, the 75 women are, in the final image, one face. That one face is still not a person. The brand calls this a celebration. There's a press release. Nobody listed in the composite gets a royalty. Count what she outlives. She outlives the radio era and the crisp sound of Adelaide Hawley Cumming reading recipe copy into a studio microphone. She outlives the Depression-era Bisquick pitch, the wartime rationing bulletins, the post-war pivot back to kitchen-first living. She outlives the All-American Homemaker of Tomorrow contest, which quietly ends in 1976 after running for 22 years and testing somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 million senior girls annually on how to run a house they didn't own yet. The contest ends. The scholarship money stops. Betty Crocker moves on to the next product line without comment. A home economist named Carol, she has been in the Golden Valley test kitchen since 1962, cleans out her desk in 1988. She takes a spatula she particularly liked. It is, technically, General Mills property. She takes it anyway. The recipes she developed over those 26 years are still in print, attributed to a woman who was invented before Carol was born. The spatula fits in her bag without a problem. The cookbooks keep selling. 65 million copies across the series by the end of the century, which is a number large enough that it stops meaning anything specific and starts meaning everywhere. Someone's kitchen in Tulsa. Someone's kitchen in Bangor. A worn copy with a cracked spine held together by a rubber band, soft, faded, and faintly greasy, open to the same page for 40 years. The book doesn't know it's an advertisement. The reader never thought to ask. By the 1990s, she has a home on the screen, the same friendly name glowing back at you, same authoritative warmth, same company behind the curtain. She is, in 1996, what she was in 1921, anonymous in origin, friendly in tone, commercially motivated throughout. The medium changes, the mechanic doesn't. She has always been exactly what she was on the first day, a signature at the bottom of a letter, written by someone else, in the name of someone who wasn't there. And so here we are, at the end of the day in Betty Crocker's kitchen, the one run by a woman who was a signature before she was a face before she was a voice, and a voice before anyone noticed she'd never once held a spoon. You wrote her a letter and a stranger wrote back, warm and certain, and signed in a hand that belonged to no one. You listened to her on the radio, 7 million of you at a time, and felt less alone. You cracked one carefully engineered egg into a box of powder and felt, briefly, like you'd made something. You sat an exam, in your good clothes, on how to run a house you didn't own yet. The casserole, somehow, had no vegetables in it at all. It's a strange thing to fall asleep to, a kitchen that never existed, but the warmth in it was real even when the woman wasn't. The home economists were real. Marjorie was real. The faces folded into that portrait belonged to women who went to work on a Tuesday, sat for an artist, and went home to make dinner under their own names, quietly, where it counted. There were 18 men at the Washburn Mill too, gone in a cloud of flour dust in 1878, never in the portrait and never in the footnotes. The kitchen stayed warm anyway. It always did. So thank you for spending the evening here, in the warm room with the frosted window and the oven that's doing its best. You don't need a friendly fiction to tell you you're doing fine. You are. Let your shoulders drop. Let the oven cool. Let the recipe card stay propped against the canister until morning. Nobody is checking it tonight. Good night.